On the morning of June 6, 1944, while Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, a peculiar unit of American soldiers prepared for an entirely different kind of invasion. These weren't your typical infantrymen. Among them stood fashion designers from Fifth Avenue, advertising illustrators from Madison Avenue, set designers from Hollywood, and fine artists from Greenwich Village. They carried paintbrushes alongside their weapons, sketch pads tucked into their rucksacks. They were the Ghost Army, officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and their mission was as audacious as it was unprecedented: to deceive the German Wehrmacht using nothing but creativity, illusion, and theatrical bravado. The story of how America weaponized its artists begins not on European battlefields, but in the desperate strategic calculations of 1942. The United States had entered World War II with industrial might but faced a cunning, experienced enemy. German forces had conquered most of Europe through superior tactics and brutal efficiency. American military planners realized that conventional warfare alone might not be enough. They needed innovation, misdirection, psychological warfare. Someone in the War Department had a radical idea. What if artists, trained to manipulate perception and create convincing illusions, could be transformed into tactical weapons? Major Ralph Ingersoll, a former publisher who had observed British deception units in North Africa, championed the concept. The British had already experimented with camouflage and dummy installations, but Ingersoll envisioned something far more ambitious. He wanted to create phantom armies that could fool German intelligence so completely that enemy divisions would be redeployed to face threats that didn't exist. According to historical documentation preserved in the National Archives, Ingersoll's proposal initially met with skepticism from traditional military brass who couldn't fathom how painters and sculptors could contribute to winning a war. But desperate times demanded creative solutions. By January 19, 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The recruitment process specifically targeted art schools, advertising agencies, and design studios. The Army needed individuals who understood perspective, shadow, light, and most crucially, how to make fiction appear as reality. They found their candidates at institutions like the Pratt Institute, the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art, and Cooper Union. The unit assembled was extraordinary. Bill Blass, who would later become a legendary fashion designer, enlisted. So did Ellsworth Kelly, destined to become one of America's most celebrated abstract artists. Art Kane, the future renowned photographer, joined their ranks. These weren't men running from combat. They were volunteers who wanted to serve but would do so with the skills they had spent years cultivating. Most were in their early 20s, talented but unproven, eager to transform their creative abilities into something that could save lives and shorten the war. Their training began immediately, and unlike anything the military had attempted before. These artist soldiers learned to operate inflatable rubber tanks that could be erected in hours, weighted down with air compressors that kept them rigid. They practiced painting shadows on flat canvas to create three-dimensional illusions visible from German reconnaissance aircraft flying at 10,000 feet. They studied sound engineering, learning to broadcast recordings of tank divisions and artillery batteries from massive speakers mounted on trucks. Most importantly, they learned to think like battlefield commanders while maintaining the mindset of stage directors, orchestrating elaborate theatrical productions where the audience was the enemy and the stakes were measured in human lives. The Ghost Army sailed for England in early May 1944, arriving at a staging area in the English countryside where thousands of soldiers prepared for the Normandy invasion. While other units conducted weapons training and amphibious assault drills, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops unpacked their peculiar arsenal: inflatable Sherman tanks, collapsible artillery pieces made from wood and rubber, fake radio equipment, and portable sound systems capable of broadcasting battlefield noises across several miles. Their first major operation, codenamed Elephant, launched on June 15th, just 9 days after D-Day. The objective was deceptively simple yet strategically crucial: convince German forces that a major, American Armored Division was positioned near the front lines in one location while the actual division had secretly moved to attack elsewhere. The Ghost Army deployed near Château de Travers in Normandy, transforming an empty field into an apparently bustling military encampment virtually overnight. The operation required meticulous attention to detail that only artists could provide. Corporal Arthur Shilstone, a talented illustrator from Connecticut, supervised the placement of inflatable tanks, ensuring each cast appropriate shadows based on the sun's position. He understood that German aerial reconnaissance analysts would scrutinize photographs for inconsistencies. The inflatable tanks, manufactured by tire companies back in the States, were technological marvels, weighing just 100 pounds each yet appearing identical to the 30-ton Sherman tanks from 500 feet above. But visual deception was only one component. Technical Sergeant Harold Dahl, a sound engineer who had worked in radio before the war, orchestrated elaborate audio deceptions. His unit hauled massive speakers into positions along the front lines, then broadcast pre-recorded sounds of tank columns, shouted commands, and supply trucks rumbling through mud. According to accounts detailed in Rick Bayer's book, The Ghost Army of World War II, Dahl's team could project these sounds up to 15 miles, creating the auditory signature of a mechanized division where none existed. The radio deception proved equally sophisticated. Specialists tapped into German signal intelligence networks, creating false radio traffic that mimicked the communication patterns of legitimate American divisions. Operators would transmit coded messages about supply requisitions, casualty reports, and tactical movements, all completely fabricated but consistent with how genuine units communicated. German intelligence officers, listening to these intercepted transmissions, had no reason to doubt they were monitoring real American forces. The illusion was completed by special effects teams who added weathering to their dummy equipment. Fresh rubber tanks would look suspiciously pristine to German observers, so artists applied paint, mud, and artificial wear patterns. They slashed fake treads into the ground beneath inflatable vehicles. They scattered empty ration boxes and cigarette butts around campsites. Private Jack Massey, who had worked as a window dresser at Bloomingdale's department store, applied his merchandising expertise to staging these theatrical military sets, understanding that authenticity lay in the accumulation of small, convincing details. Operation Elephant succeeded beyond expectations. German units remained fixated on the Ghost Army's position while the real American Armored Division launched a devastating surprise attack 20 miles away. After the battle, captured German intelligence maps showed enemy analysts had identified exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them to look, marking concentrations of American armor that existed only in paint, rubber, and sound waves. The success of Elephant established the Ghost Army's value and earned them increasingly critical assignments. From Normandy through the autumn of 1944, they conducted operation after operation, each more audacious than the last. They impersonated the 2nd Armored Division, the 6th Armored Division, and multiple infantry regiments. They staged phantom river crossings, complete with bridging equipment and engineering battalions that were nothing more than painted canvas and recorded construction sounds. Yet this dangerous theater came with genuine risks. The Ghost Army typically operated within artillery range of German positions, sometimes just a few miles from enemy lines. Unlike regular deception units that worked far behind friendly territory, these artist soldiers placed themselves directly in harm's way. They couldn't defend themselves effectively, their rubber tanks fired no shells, their wooden artillery pieces launched no rounds. If German forces discovered the deception and attacked, the Ghost Army would be virtually defenseless. Several close calls hammered home this reality. During one operation near Brest, German artillery began ranging in on their position after spotting the dummy installations. The men scrambled to evacuate their inflatable equipment while shells exploded around them. Private Harold Lehner, an architecture student from Brooklyn, was wounded by shrapnel while deflating a rubber tank. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Men creating the illusion of military power were among the most vulnerable soldiers on the battlefield. The frozen forests of Luxembourg in December 1944 became the Ghost Army's most crucial theater of deception. Hitler's massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had thrown Allied plans into chaos. German panzer divisions had punched through thinly defended American lines, creating a dangerous salient that threatened to split Allied forces and potentially recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp. General Omar Bradley faced an impossible dilemma. He needed to rapidly redeploy forces to contain the German breakthrough, but moving divisions left dangerous gaps elsewhere along the front. If the Wehrmacht discovered these weakened positions, they could exploit them with secondary attacks. Bradley's staff turned to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops with an urgent request. Could the Ghost Army make it appear that American divisions remained in positions they were actually abandoning? The mission, designated Operation Koblenz, began on December 20, 1944, in conditions that made deception work nearly impossible. Temperatures plummeted below zero. Heavy snow blanketed the region. The men of the Ghost Army, accustomed to working under cover of darkness, now had to erect their elaborate theatrical sets in howling winter storms while German patrol activity intensified. Corporal Ned Harris, a watercolor painter from Maine, found himself directing the placement of inflatable artillery pieces in a clearing outside Luxembourg City. His hands, numbed by cold even through 2 pairs of gloves, struggled with the inflation equipment. Each howitzer-shaped balloon required 30 minutes of pumping in the freezing temperatures versus 15 minutes in normal conditions. The rubber, stiffened by cold, resisted inflation and cracked more easily. Harris and his team worked through the night, knowing that German reconnaissance flights would resume at dawn. The sound deception teams faced equally brutal challenges. Sergeant Victor Dowd, a former recording studio engineer from Chicago, discovered that frozen ground transmitted sound differently than the soft earth they'd trained on. Worse, the cold affected their tube-based amplification equipment, causing electronic components to fail unpredictably. Dowd's unit spent hours troubleshooting technical problems while exposed to bitter winds, occasionally interrupted by the distant thump of artillery from the Bulge fighting just miles to the north. According to documents from the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, Operation Koblenz represented the Ghost Army's largest deployment to date. They simulated 2 complete divisions, approximately 30,000 men, 300 tanks, and countless support vehicles using fewer than 1,200 actual soldiers and their inventory of deception equipment. The scale was audacious, perhaps reckless, but the strategic situation demanded risks. The radio deception component became particularly sophisticated. Technical Sergeant Dick Syracuse, who had studied electrical engineering at MIT before enlisting, coordinated a complex web of false communications. His team transmitted routine administrative messages, simulated supply requisitions for thousands of soldiers, and even broadcast fake personal messages that German intelligence would intercept. They created the electronic signature of a bustling divisional headquarters managing the daily operations of forces that existed only in the electromagnetic spectrum. What made this deception especially challenging was maintaining the illusion over an extended period. Previous Ghost Army operations typically lasted 48 to 72 hours, enough time for a real division to move into attack position. But Operation Koblenz needed to hold for nearly 2 weeks while American forces reorganized to counter the German offensive. That meant keeping the dummy installations realistic despite deteriorating weather conditions, maintaining consistent radio traffic patterns, and ensuring that every detail remained convincing to increasingly suspicious German intelligence officers. The Ghost Army supplemented their technical deception with human intelligence operations that bordered on performance art. Small teams, wearing the shoulder patches of the divisions they were impersonating, were sent into nearby Luxembourg City. They visited cafes, taverns, and shops, making sure to be overheard discussing their unit's activities. They complained about their commanding officers, speculated about upcoming movements, and behaved exactly like off-duty soldiers from legitimate combat divisions. Private Arthur Shilstone recalled entering a bar near the Luxembourg train station, wearing the 2nd Armored Division patch. He deliberately left behind a notebook containing sketches and notes that appeared to reference defensive positions, knowing that German intelligence had cultivated informants in the city. The notebook was entirely fabricated. Shilstone had spent 3 hours creating convincing-looking military sketches of positions that didn't exist, but if it fell into enemy hands, it would reinforce the larger deception. The psychological toll on these artist soldiers intensified during the Luxembourg operation. They lived with the knowledge that if their deception failed, German forces might exploit the gaps in American lines, potentially leading to thousands of casualties. Every morning, they scanned the horizon for German reconnaissance aircraft, knowing that a single suspicious photograph analyzed by a competent intelligence officer could unravel everything. Yet, as December turned to January 1945, Operation Koblenz achieved its objective. German forces, believing substantial American divisions remained in position around Luxembourg, failed to exploit the temporary weaknesses in Allied lines. The real American divisions completed their redeployment, sealed the Bulge salient, and began pushing German forces back. Post-war analysis of captured German intelligence documents revealed that Wehrmacht commanders had indeed believed the Ghost Army's Phantom divisions were genuine, basing tactical decisions on this false information. As Allied forces advanced toward the German heartland in early 1945, the Rhine River loomed as the final major geographic barrier. The Wehrmacht had destroyed most bridges during their retreat, transforming the Rhine into a natural fortress protecting the industrial Ruhr Valley. Allied commanders planned multiple river crossings to overwhelm German defenses, but they needed surprise. The Ghost Army received orders for their most ambitious deception yet. Convinced the Germans that the main Allied crossing would occur 30 miles north of the actual assault location. Operation Weersinn launched on March 1, 1945, in the war-battered German town whose name it bore. The objective was straightforward, but execution proved nightmarishly complex. Simulate the Ninth Army preparing to force a major Rhine crossing near Weersinn, while the real assault developed near Wesel. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If German forces concentrated at the wrong crossing point, thousands of American and British lives would be saved during the actual operation. The Ghost Army established their deception headquarters in a partially destroyed factory outside Weersinn. Lieutenant Fox Strangways, an architect from Philadelphia who now commanded one of the camouflage battalions, coordinated the visual elements. His teams deployed more than 300 inflatable vehicles, including amphibious craft that suggested preparation for river assault operations. They constructed dummy pontoon bridges from timber and canvas, designed to be visible from German observation posts across the Rhine, but selling this deception required more than static displays. Corporal Bill Blass, the future fashion designer, led a team creating an entire phantom logistics operation. They staged supply dumps filled with empty crates painted to resemble ammunition boxes. They erected field hospitals with Red Cross markings. They even established fake motor pools with mechanics seemingly maintaining assault boats and amphibious vehicles. From German positions across the river, binoculars and telescopes would reveal exactly what Wehrmacht intelligence expected to see before a major river crossing: massive preparation, concentration of force, and the telltale bustle of an army preparing to attack. The sonic deception for Operation Weersinn represented the Ghost Army's most sophisticated audio illusion. Sergeant John Haptus, a sound engineer who had worked on Broadway productions before the war, orchestrated a symphony of battlefield noises designed to be heard across the Rhine. His team positioned their massive speakers along the riverbank, then broadcast continuous sounds of engineering work: pile drivers, bulldozers, welding equipment, and the distinctive metallic clanging of pontoon bridge construction. These recordings weren't generic background noise. Haptus had spent months collecting authentic sounds from actual engineering units building river crossings. He understood that German intelligence officers, many with combat experience, would recognize the specific acoustic signature of bridge construction. The recordings included the particular echo patterns created by steel pontoons being maneuvered into position, the hydraulic whine of crane equipment, and even the shouted commands of engineering sergeants directing their crews. According to research documented in The Ghost Army of World War II, these audio illusions could fool listeners even just hundreds of yards away, creating completely convincing false impressions of military activity. Radio deception reached new levels of complexity during Weersinn. The Ghost Army's signals unit created an entire phantom communications network mimicking an army corps preparing for major operations. Technical Sergeant Walter Arnett, who had worked as an amateur radio operator in civilian life, supervised operators generating hundreds of false messages daily. They transmitted encoded supply requisitions for bridge-building equipment. They sent weather reports relevant to river crossing operations. They broadcast communications between fake engineering battalions and phantom artillery units, supposedly pre-registering targets across the Rhine. What made this radio deception particularly effective was its integration with actual military communications. The Ghost Army operators carefully studied the communication patterns of genuine Army units, replicating their timing, frequency usage, and even the individual sending styles of real radio operators. German signals intelligence couldn't distinguish between legitimate transmissions and the ghost Army's fabrications because the false traffic was woven seamlessly into the broader tapestry of Allied communications. The human element of the deception proved equally critical. Teams of Ghost Army soldiers, wearing the shoulder patches and insignia of assault divisions, made highly visible appearances in towns and villages near Viersen. They frequented local establishments, discussed their supposedly imminent river crossing mission with calculated indiscretion, and behaved like soldiers steeling themselves for a dangerous assault. Some even mailed letters from field post offices, knowing German intelligence intercepted Allied mail. Private Ellsworth Kelly, the future abstract artist, participated in one of these theatrical infiltrations. He and 3 other soldiers, all wearing First Army patches, spent an evening in a Viersen tavern that intelligence suggested was being watched by German agents. They played their roles perfectly, nervous young soldiers drinking too much before a dangerous operation, talking too freely about when and where they expected to cross the Rhine. Kelly later recalled the surreal experience of essentially performing in an enemy theater production, where the audience was deadly serious and the consequences of a poor performance could be measured in lives lost. The Ghost Army maintained Operation Viersen for 3 weeks, an unprecedented duration that tested both their equipment and their operational security. Inflatable tanks developed leaks and required constant repairs. Dummy installations needed continuous maintenance as spring weather deteriorated canvas and rubber. The sound equipment, running nearly continuously to maintain the illusion of round-the-clock engineering work, suffered mechanical failures that required improvised repairs under field conditions. Not every Ghost Army operation ended in unqualified success. The price of deception, measured in sweat, ingenuity, and occasionally blood, became starkly apparent during Operation Buzenville in late March 1945. The mission seemed routine: simulate an armored division preparing to attack toward the Saar River, drawing German attention away from the actual American thrust developing 40 miles south. But routine operations didn't exist when working hundreds of yards from enemy positions. Corporal Arthur Singer, a commercial artist from Chicago, was supervising the installation of inflatable tanks in a forest clearing near Buzenville when German artillery opened fire. The Wehrmacht had apparently detected the unusual activity and decided to probe with indirect fire. Singer and his crew scrambled for cover as high explosive shells detonated among the trees, shredding rubber tanks and sending equipment flying. Private Robert Dahl took shrapnel in his left leg, becoming one of the few Ghost Army casualties despite their consistently hazardous assignments. The incident forced tactical adjustments. The Ghost Army had always operated dangerously close to German lines. Their deceptions only worked if enemy intelligence could observe them, but German forces in early 1945 were increasingly desperate and unpredictable. Retreating Wehrmacht units sometimes launched counterattacks or artillery strikes against targets that would have been ignored months earlier. The Ghost Army's dummy installations, meant to deceive from a distance, offered no protection if German forces decided to shell them directly or, worse, probe them with ground attacks. Captain George Martin, who commanded one of the camouflage companies, implemented new security protocols after Buzenville. Real artillery and machine gun units were positioned to defend Ghost Army installations. Infantry patrols established security perimeters. The artists who had once worked in relative isolation now operated under armed guard, a reminder that their theatrical deceptions played out on a stage where the audience occasionally shot back. Despite these dangers, the operational tempo increased as Allied armies penetrated deeper into Germany. The Ghost Army conducted operations in rapid succession, sometimes maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously. Sergeant Edward Bayau, a former advertising executive who handled logistics, later estimated his unit moved more than 500 tons of equipment across hundreds of miles during March and April 1945, conducting major operations in 7 different sectors. The physical toll on these soldiers intensified. Unlike conventional infantry units that rotated through front line and rest positions, the Ghost Army remained almost continuously operational. Their specialized knowledge meant there were no replacement units, no rest battalions to assume their duties. Corporal Harold Dahl, the sound engineer, later recalled working 80-hour weeks, catching sleep in trucks between operations, subsisting on cold rations because stopping to prepare hot meals would waste precious operational time. Yet their work unquestionably saved lives. Post-war analysis of German military records, conducted by American intelligence officers examining captured Wehrmacht documents, revealed the extent of the Ghost Army's success. In operation after operation, German commanders had redeployed forces to counter phantom American units. Panzer divisions were held in reserve against attacks that never materialized. Artillery concentrations were established to defend positions the Americans never actually assaulted. Intelligence resources were devoted to tracking divisions that existed only in paint, rubber, and radio waves. Colonel William Harris, who served as an intelligence analyst evaluating the Ghost Army's effectiveness after the war, estimated their deceptions directly contributed to saving between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. The methodology behind these calculations was conservative, examining specific operations where German forces demonstrably redeployed based on Ghost Army deceptions, then calculating probable Allied casualties had those German forces been correctly positioned to defend against actual attacks. This analysis, preserved in classified after-action reports, provided statistical validation for what the Ghost Army's members had intuitively understood. Their art was saving soldiers' lives. The psychological burden of this knowledge weighed heavily on some Ghost Army members. They understood that every successful deception potentially meant dozens or hundreds of soldiers would return home to their families instead of dying in combat. Private George van der Sluis, a painter who specialized in creating dummy installations, later reflected on the moral weight of military deception. He described a conversation with an infantry captain whose regiment had benefited from a Ghost Army operation that drew German forces away from their actual assault route. The captain told van der Sluis that his company had expected 50% casualties but suffered less than 5% because the German defensive positions were undermanned. Someone else's son, brother, or husband was alive because artists had successfully lied to the Wehrmacht. This knowledge created a peculiar pride mixed with humility. The Ghost Army never sought glory. Their operations remained classified for decades after the war. They wore no distinctive insignia beyond their standard unit patches. They earned no special decorations for their deception work. Most returned home and resumed their civilian careers without ever discussing what they had done during the war. Yet they carried the quiet satisfaction of having discovered that creativity could be as powerful as firepower, that imagination properly applied could defeat armor and artillery. As spring 1945 brought the war in Europe toward its conclusion, the Ghost Army prepared for what everyone assumed would be their most significant operation, deceiving German forces during the final assault into Germany's industrial heartland. But history had other plans. By mid-April 1945, Germany's military collapse accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. Allied armies advanced rapidly against disintegrating Wehrmacht resistance. Cities fell with surprising speed. The Ghost Army found themselves struggling to keep pace with the breakneck advance, sometimes arriving at designated deception sites only to discover American forces had already captured objectives miles beyond their planned targets. Operation Malone, launched on April 18th along the Danube River, exemplified these changing circumstances. The Ghost Army was supposed to simulate preparations for a major river crossing, But by the time they erected their dummy installations, reconnaissance patrols reported German forces abandoning defensive positions and retreating eastward. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, the Ghost Army's commanding officer, faced an unusual dilemma. Should they continue an elaborate deception against an enemy that might no longer be watching? Simonson decided to proceed. Even retreating German forces might regroup if they believed they faced overwhelming American strength in pursuit. The Ghost Army deployed their full repertoire: inflatable tanks, recorded sounds of mechanized columns, radio traffic suggesting multiple divisions converging on the Danube. But there was an almost melancholy quality to this late-war deception. Technical Sergeant Bernie Mason, who operated the sound equipment, later described broadcasting tank noises into an eerily quiet landscape, uncertain whether any German intelligence officers remained to be fooled. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For the Ghost Army, victory brought an odd anticlimax. They had trained for years, perfected deceptions that could alter the course of battles, and operated continuously under dangerous conditions. Now suddenly, their unique skills were obsolete. The Army had no further use for inflatable tanks or theatrical military deceptions. Their mission was complete, but their contribution remained secret. Demobilization began immediately. The specialists who had been carefully recruited from art schools and advertising agencies were no longer needed. By June, soldiers started shipping home, carrying their memories and experiences back to civilian life. Corporal Bill Blass returned to New York and launched his fashion empire, eventually becoming one of America's most celebrated designers. He rarely mentioned his military service, and when he did, he spoke vaguely about special assignments without revealing the Ghost Army's true nature. Ellsworth Kelly went home to develop his artistic career, eventually gaining recognition as a pioneering abstract artist whose work hangs in major museums worldwide. His Ghost Army experience, with its emphasis on perspective, illusion, and visual trickery, undoubtedly influenced his artistic development. Yet Kelly, like most Ghost Army veterans, maintained silence about his wartime service for decades. The Army classified virtually everything related to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The techniques they pioneered might prove useful in future conflicts, military planners reasoned, so operational details were sealed. Unit members received standard discharge papers that listed their service only as special troops with no elaboration. The inflatable tanks, carefully transported back to the United States, disappeared into military warehouses. The sound equipment was dismantled. The carefully crafted doctrine of tactical deception was filed in classified archives. For nearly 40 years, the Ghost Army remained hidden in bureaucratic secrecy. Historians writing about World War II had no knowledge of their operations. Military analyses of campaigns in France and Germany never mentioned their contributions. The veterans themselves, bound by security classifications and habituated to secrecy, rarely discussed their service even among themselves. Family members knew their fathers or uncles had served in Europe, but nothing about the extraordinary nature of their work. This silence began to crack in the early 1980s. Some Ghost Army veterans, now middle-aged or elderly, started cautiously sharing stories. A few contacted each other, rekindling friendships formed under extraordinary circumstances. They began questioning why their unit's remarkable achievements remained classified decades after the war's conclusion. There seemed no legitimate security reason to continue hiding what the Ghost Army had accomplished. In 1985, a group of veterans formally petitioned the Department of Defense to declassify their unit's records. The request slowly worked through bureaucratic channels. Finally, in 1996, more than 50 years after the Ghost Army's formation, the military declassified significant portions of their operational history. Suddenly, military historians gained access to after-action reports, operational summaries, and the documentation that revealed one of the war's most unusual and effective units. The declassification sparked renewed interest in the Ghost Army's story. Historians began interviewing surviving members, now in their 70s and 80s. Rick Bayer produced a documentary and book, The Ghost Army of World War II, bringing their story to public attention. PBS aired a documentary in 2013. Finally giving these aging veterans recognition for their remarkable service. What emerged from this historical recovery was a story that challenged conventional understanding of warfare and courage. The Ghost Army demonstrated that in modern combat, deception and creativity could be as tactically valuable as firepower and armor. These artist-stern soldiers proved that saving lives sometimes requires not greater violence, but more sophisticated application of intellect and imagination. The Ghost Army's legacy extended beyond their specific military achievements. Many members went on to distinguish civilian careers that shaped American culture. Beyond Bill Blass and Ellsworth Kelly, the unit produced influential designers, artists, photographers, and architects whose aesthetic sensibilities had been refined under the most intense circumstances imaginable. Art Kane became one of the 20th century's most celebrated photographers. Arthur Shilstone gained recognition as a leading illustrator. George Diestel found success in industrial design. The Ghost Army became a remarkable incubator of creative talent, though the connection between their military service and later achievements remained hidden for decades. Understanding the Ghost Army's full significance requires examining how military theory intersects with artistic practice. These men succeeded not because they were good soldiers who happened to know art, but because artistic skills directly translated into tactical advantages that conventional military training couldn't provide. Their story reveals profound truths about perception, deception, and how creativity functions as a force multiplier in warfare. The foundation of every Ghost Army operation rested on understanding how human perception works. Staff Sergeant John Jarvie, who had studied theatrical design at Yale before the war, recognized that military intelligence officers, analyzing reconnaissance photographs or intercepted communications, weren't seeing objective reality. They were interpreting visual and auditory information through cognitive frameworks shaped by expectations and experience. This psychological insight drove Ghost Army methodology. They didn't create perfect replicas of military equipment. They created convincing impressions filtered through the limitations of enemy observation. An inflatable tank viewed through binoculars from 2 miles away, photographed from a reconnaissance aircraft at 15,000 feet, or glimpsed briefly through artillery smoke didn't need to be perfectly realistic. It needed to match what German intelligence analysts expected to see. This understanding separated the Ghost Army's sophisticated deceptions from crude attempts at military camouflage. Consider the art of shadow. Corporal Ned Harris spent weeks studying how sunlight and shadow define three-dimensional form in military reconnaissance photography. He learned that German photo interpreters paid particular attention to shadows when assessing whether vehicles were genuine or decoys. A shadow's length, angle, and darkness provided crucial information about an object's height, mass, and